Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with another swatch video and today I'm tackling my Pastel Roses eyeshadows. I did my Glam Shop eyeshadows recently and I would move on to the next brand, which is again the Pastel Roses. I have a few more shades this time than I did last time, so this might be a bit of a longer video. But before I jump into any of the swatches, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. Let's jump into the video. The first eyeshadow we have here is the shadow Taurus. This is a very smooth eyeshadow with a drier formula. The particle size is quite small, which also means it doesn't have many sparkles, and in general is quite a dull shade. This is a red iridescent, very reminiscent of Terra Moon's Red Giant and Cleona Ray. The main shift is a bit of a pinkier red that goes into a gold, and it almost turns cool toned blue at the edges in indirect light. It's a pretty shade, but I prefer the other two shades that I mentioned in this kind of shift. Next up we have Ultraviolet. This is yet again a drier shadow. Most of the Pastel Roses shadow I have is this formula. The particle size is a little bit larger, but it's still on the smaller side. However, this shadow has more shine and sparkle to it. This is another shadow that is a dupe of Cleona UV, and I know Terra Moons have an equivalent shade, but I can't remember the name at the moment. This eyeshadow doesn't really have a shift, but it is more of an electric purpley blue kind of shadow that perfectly matches the name. Again, since it is an iridescent, the base almost disappears when it's out of the light. Fairy Dust. This is another iridescent, and this one does again have a slightly larger particle size, which means it sparkles. However, again, the formula is drier. This shadow is probably the most twinkly so far. This is a beautiful eyeshadow, however I don't find the shift too strong. The main part of the shift is a light cool tone blue, and if anything it shifts more into a cool tone pink at the very edges, but again it's not very obvious. It's definitely not my favorite blue iridescent in my collection. Bombshell. So we're getting into the formula that I prefer a little bit better. This one is a little bit sparklier and the particle size is on the small to medium side. It's kind of a running theme, but it's still quite dry. However, this one is a little bit better than the previous ones. I love this shade, and the main shift is kind of like a warm green that shifts very obviously into a pinky purple. You can also in certain angles see kind of tones like blue and violet, and I wouldn't say this is an iridescent that is very unique, but it's quite a good version of this shadow. Next up we have Little Star. And we're back with a shadow that has a smaller particle size and is on the smoother side. It does have a few sparkles coming through, but overall it smooths out to almost an opaque color. This is not the most shifty shadow, and again the main shift is a warm tone kind of sage green, if that's even a thing, and it shifts into a purple and then a blue. However, the contrast is not nearly as strong as in the last shadow. This is quite a nice subtle everyday shade, which makes it quite wearable. Pixie. So this one reminds me a lot of the first one that I shared, Taurus. This one also has a smooth finish that is more on the satiny side, and the particle size is again very small with no distinct sparkles. So not just the formula reminds me of Taurus, it's also the color. The shift is almost exact as the last one with that pinky red running through it. However, it has a very strong yellow base. In the shadow you can also see some orange shifts coming through, but I think that's mainly due to the base. Citrus. This is another more satiny shadow. If anything, this has maybe a slightly more sparkles than the last. And again, the formula is very dry, which I mentioned is a running theme. This is another eyeshadow that doesn't really have any specific shifts. The color is very primary yellow, and if I had to say anything, it almost have a burnt orange red kind of shift coming through. However, I keep this shadow around mainly because of the yellow color, and I found that I don't have too many yellow shimmers in my collection. Next up we have Pyramid. This eyeshadow has a small to medium particle size, and again, it's definitely sparklier than the last couple ones that we talked about. This one feels a little bit smoother to the touch as well. The shadow is another yellow, however, this one is more on the antique side. The main shift is an orangey kind of yellow that shifts into gold and then a green. The eyeshadow doesn't really have much of a base color once sheared out, but once built up, it has more of a warm tan base. Lime Twist. This shadow has a medium particle size and looks quite sparkly in the pan, but once applied it does smooth out nicely, but you do have to work a little bit harder with this one. This eyeshadow has a yellowy green kind of look to it in the pan, but the main shift on the lid is almost like a golden yellow. It then also has shifts of lime green and at the very end almost a blue. This one is quite shifty, but since the colors are so close together, I would say it's not very obvious. Dragonfly. This eyeshadow is another medium-sized particle shade. It's a beautiful eyeshadow, but it definitely needs to be built up. But however, when you build it up, it does provide a really nice sparkle throughout. This eyeshadow is such a fun one. It reminds me a lot of a couple Terra Moon's eyeshadows. I can't remember the exact names. I know one of them is Ganymede, but I did share the exact eyeshadow dupes in my dupe video. The shifts goes from a grassy green base with gold and pink running through it. You can also see almost orange sparkles too, and the main shift is that pinky orangey shade. However, the green is still very visible. Autumn Leaves. This eyeshadow is a marble shade where the pigments are separated throughout. However, the particle size is on the medium side and smooths out quite well. This eyeshadow always confuses me because in the pan I feel like it looks a lot warmer than it is in the swatch. I mean, don't get me wrong, it definitely has the same tones as in the pan itself, but mixed together they just create a bit more of a neutral tone green rather than that bright, warm kind of yellow green that you see in the pan. The base is a mustard yellow that goes into a neutral tone grass green with lots of sparkles, and at a very harsh angle you can almost see a pink shift. Starburst. This eyeshadow has a smaller particle size but still looks very dimensional in the pan. Although having a smaller particle size, the shadow is quite textured and has a lot of sparkles throughout. This shadow has again a mustard yellow base and shifts into a grass green. However, this shadow is definitely brighter and it has the same pink shift at an angle, but it's way more noticeable. Starfish. So we have another shadow with a very similar texture. The particle size is on the small to medium size, but again it has a lot of sparkles once swatched out. This shadow has a very similar shift to the last ones that I mentioned, but it's not exactly the same. Instead of having that mustardy yellow base, it has a burnt orangey kind of brownie base. I would say that it almost has like a classical blue-brown eyeshadow, but instead of having the blue shift, you have a very clear green shift. Sunlight. I would say that this one again has a similar formula to the last ones and a similar particle size. However, this shadow is definitely drier and is slightly crumblier in the pan. This one is again very similar, so I clearly have a type when it comes to eyeshadows, but it is less saturated and the yellow base is almost on the beige side, but it has the same warm tone green to pink shift. I promise this is the last shadow that I have that is like this, so let's move on to some other ones. Pumpkin. So we have another marble shadow, and this one came from the same collection as Autumn Leaves and looks the same in the pan with the same formula. This one also confuses me in the same way that Autumn Leaves does, because in the pan there's definitely a lot of warm toned pigment showing. However, once swatched out it leans more cool toned. The only warm tone thing about it is the base, And even so, it's warm tone kind of minky taupey brown. The shift itself has a lot of dimension to it. You can definitely see both cool toned green, blue, silver, violet, and purple shifts. There's even a little bit of a gold sparkle running through it, and the shadows is actually super dimensional, especially for a neutral shadow. Black Friday. So this one is actually a bit of a strange one because I got this one as a free gift during the Black Friday sale, so I don't have a name on it. This eyeshadow honestly isn't my favorite. It's very smooth and more of a traditional shimmer, and it doesn't really have any shifts to it. In the pan, I would say that this one looks a bit more cool toned. However, when swatched out, you can see there is a warm tone, kind of orangey antique gold. It does have a nice sparkle through, but again, it's not a favorite, and I'm honestly thinking about decluttering this one. Electric Orange. This eyeshadow has a very small particle size, and it is quite crumbly in the pan also. This is a very fiery eyeshadow. It does have a pinky red main shift that goes into an orange and then a bright yellow at the very end. When out of the light, the base kind of shows up as well, which is this sorbet kind of orange. It's a really pretty shadow, but I have actually declared this for my collection, but only because it is more on the satiny side and I have very similar shadows in better formulas that I prefer. So it is a nice one, but it's not my favorite. Sandstorm. This eyeshadow is on the medium particle size. It's definitely a lot more sparklier than the last shadow. It does provide a lot of texture, but it's still pretty easy to work with, and the formula is again on the drier side. This is an eyeshadow that is quite similar to the last one, but I do prefer this formula. You can probably see how similar they are. They have the same yellow kind of shift at the very end, where the main shift is that pinky red again. This one also does have those orangey tones to it, so this one kind of covers all the bases that the last one did. However, in this one I can also see some kind of lime green shifts coming through, which makes it quite unique. Lure. This eyeshadow has a large particle size. It's not super chunky or anything, but it is probably one of the chunkiest that we have spoken about today. This one is also quite similar to the last ones. It's a very fiery eyeshadow. It has similar shifts, but instead of having that pinky kind of red main shift, it does lean a lot more orange, but similarly to Sandstorm, it does also have kind of those goldeny shifts and also a bit of lime green at certain angles. I do love this one a lot, and both of these two that I mentioned just now are some of the reasons why I have decluttered Electric Orange. Nectarine. This is actually a shadow that is slightly less dry than the other ones. It does have almost like a slick feeling to it, and it picks up quite sheerly. The particle size is on the small to medium size, but it still has a lot of sparkles through it, which makes it really nice and interesting. This eyeshadow is very unique compared to some of the other ones because the base is quite strong in this one. A lot of the Pastel Roses eyeshadows are very sheer in the base, but this one shows up quite distinctly and has its own shifts. The base is this really reddish toned orange. It's almost like a primal orange. It's very, very pretty. And then the main shift in the shadow is a green, and the green leans a bit more yellow tone, so a bit more of a warmer green. And then at the very end, it does go into pink shifts. So it is similar in the shifts to some of the earlier shadows that we spoke about, but due to the very orange base, it is very unique from the ones that I mentioned previously. Peach Rose. This eyeshadow is basically identical in formula to Lure, which I mentioned earlier, so it is on the chunkier side, and it has again a larger particle size. This one, like I said with Lure, can be a bit harder to work with, and you do have to kind of smooth these out because they are a bit chunkier. I like the shade of this a lot. It is this kind of peach shade, but it does have almost some neutral, slightly cool tone leaning undertones to it. It's definitely still warm, but it's more toned down. And then it does have a ton of shifts in it. It does have a very bright kind of green shift at certain angles, and in other angles it goes into almost a purpley blue. It is super stunning and also very unique. So this is definitely one that I recommend if you want kind of like an elevated neutral shadow. Spectrum. This eyeshadow is again on the small to medium particle size, and it does smooth out really nicely and creates like an opaque color on your lid, but it does also have a lot of sparkles throughout. This right here is one of my favorite eyeshadows from the Pastel Roses because it's almost like a rainbow in a shadow. It has a very hot pink kind of base. It's on the warmer tone side. Then the main shift is this really like this fiery yellow. It reminds me of like a sunset. So that contrasts really, really nicely with the pink in itself. But then at under angles, you can see a blue, you can see a warm tone purple, and even green. So with all of those shifts, like I said, you get almost a rainbow. And this one is stunning on the lids, and it is very, very shifty, as you can see. And because of that, it is one of my favorites. I have similar shadows, but none of them are as shifty as this one. Rainbow. In the pan, this one looks very similar to, for example, Lure, but this one is not quite as chunky. It does still have that kind of feel in the pan, and the particle size is medium. I was very hopeful for this shadow because the name of it is Rainbow, and like I mentioned, the last eyeshadow is like a rainbow in a pan, so I thought this one would be similar. Don't get me wrong, this is a beautiful eyeshadow, but it's not as shifty as the last one. It does have a kind of deeper rosy base, and then it does have quite a green shift running through, so it does need a bit more green compared to the last one. The main shift of this one though is pink, which means that it's not as shifted as the last one because the base and the main shift are like a similar color. The main shift is a little bit brighter than the base, but it does have some really nice shifts to it. Like I mentioned already, it has that green shift, and it also goes into like a turquoise and a cool blue at certain angles. Marshmallow. This one is another one that feels a little bit different in the pan. It is more on the kind of emollient side. I mean, it's not really emollient, but compared to the rest of the shadows, it does have a little bit more of a slick to it. This shadow does have a very small particle size as well, and it smooths out almost completely, and it does have quite a strong base. This one is another super shifty one. The base is quite strong, and it is this kind of bronzy color, which goes into a main shift that is a fuchsia pink. It's very bright, and on the side it does have like a yellow kind of shift. It's not exactly the same as the base, but it does complement it in color. This one doesn't really have the most shift. It mainly does have those two. At certain angles you can see a little bit of a green too, but due to the colors of the shifts being so far apart on the kind of color wheel, it is super shifty and very, very beautiful, and I like the shadow a lot. Love Letter. This shadow has a medium particle size and is again a slightly more emollient formula than some of the other ones. This shadow also has a stronger base than some other ones that we talked about, which is this kind of warm toned tan brown. And then it has this obvious pink to gold yellow shift on top, which is very reminiscent to a lot of other shadows, such as Blaze from Cleona, and I know Davina has one as well. I think it's called Tucana, and it's quite a popular shadow, so it's not unique in any way. But I do like this shadow, and it's one of my favorites from the Pastel Roses. Bismuth. We have another marble shadow. As you can see, this one has a lot of different colors in it, and the particle size is actually quite large in this one. This eyeshadow is one of the shiftier ones that I have from Pastel Roses. When I first got this, I was a little bit disappointed because when I saw swatches online, I thought this would be a bit more neutral, but it's quite a bright but very interesting shadow. It has this kind of cornflower cool toned blue base, and then it has very strong shifts on top of pink, green, and gold. Since the particle size is a bit larger, it's also very sparkly and it's quite opaque, again, for being from the Pastel Roses. So this one is definitely unique. I don't know if they sell this one anymore, but it's quite a fun one in my collection. Starlight. This shadow again has a medium particle size and it's quite sheer initially but can be built up. This eyeshadow is one of my favorites. I love this eyeshadow. It has this kind of purpley grape base, I would say. It's quite a warm tone purple that goes into a slightly more neutral to cool tone purple with a green shift as well. This is quite a sparkly shadow and the sparkles range from that kind of green to kind of like a bluish purple shift, and I think it's absolutely stunning. It's easy to wear for every day, so it's quite a versatile shadow, and again is one of my favorites from the Pastel Roses. Galaxy Dust. This shadow is on the smaller particle size and is very smooth, both to the touch as well as in the swatch. It doesn't have many sparkles to it, but it does have a nice sheen running throughout it. Again, this shadow has more of a grape purple base, but this one is more saturated and vibrant than the last one. It then has a main shift that is this warm toned pink, as well as some side shifts that lean a bit more green, as well as bluish purple. At very strong direct light, the main shift, which is that pink shadow, almost have a bit of peach to it. Very Peri. This eyeshadow is again on the smaller particle size, but it leans a little bit more medium because it's slightly larger than the last shadow we spoke about. As with most of the Pastel Roses shadows, this one is also on the drier side. As the name would suggest with this shadow, it has a periwinkle kind of base that goes into a cooler tone purple to a yellowy gold. At certain angles, the purple base also goes a bit more warm tone purple, which means that it's quite a versatile purple shadow, and I just love the periwinkle undertones in this one. Sakura. We have another slightly larger particle sized shadow, similarly to a couple that I mentioned before, like Lure. You can kind of see that straight in the pan because it's so reflective. Although looking quite chunky in the pan, it does smooth out really nicely. And this one is quite unique when it comes to the shift. It does have almost like a coral kind of peach base, and then it goes into this really vibrant bright fuchsia pink as well as this blue. The blue leans almost turquoise and it contrasts really nicely to the pink. And although the pink looks more vibrant in the pan and is definitely visible on the eyes, the main shift is that turquoise, so it does show up a bit more blue on the eyes than pink. Magical. This shadow is again on the drier side with a very small particle size. It does smooth out really nicely and it's, I wouldn't really call it sparkly, although it has some sparkles running through it. It is very smooth looking. The shift in this one is way more impressive in the swatch than it looks in the pan. In the pan, it honestly looks quite basic, but the shift in this is very strong. It does have this kind of warm tone minty green. And then as a secondary shift, it has this kind of Barbie looking pink, which contrasts really nicely with the green, and it creates this beautiful kind of pastel shadow. It does also have a baby pink base, which is kind of what you can see in the pan. Dreamscape. We are back with another more kind of flaky shadow, or not flaky, but it does have a larger particle size, and it's very, very sparkly in the swatch. As you can see with the shadow, the shift is very obvious even in the pan, and it is more on the shiny side, as you can also see in the pan. I would say that this is the kind of brighter, more saturated version of Bismuth, which I spoke about earlier. It does have this really unique blue base kind of color, which is almost like an aqua blue. It's so stunning. And then it has this very bright pink shift, which is the main shift, as well as a secondary greeny gold shift. This shadow is stunning. It's definitely one for you if you love color. The colors also create a lot of different nuances, like for example the yellow tone shift over that really bright, almost cornflower blue creates more of a turquoisey kind of shadow. If you look at it really up close, you can also see some orangey sparkles in the pink shift. Midnight Rose. This shadow is again the more kind of normal Pastel Roses formula. It's on the medium particle size with a bit more of a drier formula again, but it does have a lot of sparkles throughout. This shadow has a muted out kind of purple base that almost has a bit of grey to it. And on top of that, it has two very distinct shifts. We've seen these shifts before. It's this kind of bright kind of blue leaning into this fuchsia pink again. These shifts work really well together because they are so contrasting, but again, the shift itself isn't very unique. However, the base is quite unique in my collection, and that creates more of a unique shadow, so I do like this one a lot. Although this is quite a bright shadow, I think since it is more buildable, I feel like this one is quite good for you if you want to use dip your toes into color, because this one is a bit more wearable. Prism. We have another slightly chunkier shadow. Again, it is on the medium to large particle size. It's also slightly less dry than the normal kind of Pastel Roses formula. This one again is quite a unique shadow. It does have a warmer purple base that shifts into a cooler purple, a blue, a yellow toned gold, as well as a green. I mentioned before how Spectrum is one of my favorite shadows from the Pastel Roses, and this one is almost like the other side of the spectrum from that shadow, because that one leaves more warm tone and this one leaves more cool tone, but both of them are quite rainbowy. This is a very fun shadow, but it's not unique. There's definitely a lot of dupes of this one out there, but it's definitely fun, especially if you like purples. But it does still have that warm tone shift, like that warm gold, so it does give a lot of contrast. Dreamcatcher. This shadow is a little bit more emollient again than some of the other ones we spoke about, and the particle size is on the medium side. This one is again a bit sheerer, but it's definitely buildable, and it's on the sparklier side. This shadow has a mauve base with a green and a pink shift. The green leans a bit more neutral, slightly on like the golden and shifty side, and the pink leans a little bit more warm toned. This is a really nice everyday shadow as well. It's almost like the warmer sister to Starburst, which I mentioned earlier, and it's another favorite. Phantom. This one also has a medium particle size. You can see that these kind of newer shadows are of this formula, but it's still quite hard pressed in the pan, which makes it buildable. This shadow is so unique. It's like a kind of grungy version of a bright multichrome. It has this grayish kind of base. It has a bit of both blue and pink to it, but it's a very, very unique base. This shadow also has a ton of shifts through it. The main shift is a muted kind of bright pink, if that even makes sense. And then it also has a green shift leaning into a turquoise and a blue. This one came out in the same collection as Bismuth, and I'm not sure if this one is available anymore, but if it is, I definitely recommend it because it's a very, very unique multichrome and I like it a lot. Moon. This shadow is a smaller particle sized eyeshadow that is again a bit smoother. Although it is a bit more of a subtle shadow, it still has a nice sheen to it, and it's definitely more reflective than some of the other satiny versions that I talked about before. This is again a very unique shadow when it comes to the shift. I kind of underestimate this shadow because in the pan it doesn't look very special, but it does have this kind of grass, almost primal green base, and then it goes into a purpley pink shift that looks a bit more purple and a lot more pink depending on the light, and it is very, very distinctive. Since the shifts are so far apart, it creates a very shifty shadow, so it's a very unique one, but I just don't reach for it very often. Zoisite. This shadow has a small to medium particle size and is again on the drier side. This one is the kind of old school Pastel Roses formula. Before buying this one, I thought it would be a dupe of Glam Shop 2, but this one is definitely on the brighter side. The base is almost like a neon green and it goes into a bluish kind of purple shift. And like we said before, since the colors are so contrasting, the shift is very obvious in this shadow. Like I said, this is similar to Tool from Glam Shop. However, this one is definitely more green leaning and the other one is more kind of turquoisey, almost blue. So they are similar, but I would definitely say that they are different enough. Palm. This shadow has a small to medium particle size. This one is again a little bit more hydrated, if that makes sense. It's not as dry as other ones. And it does have almost like a slight marble effect in the pan, but I wouldn't classify this as a marble shadow. This shadow is a fun take on a neutral. It does have almost like a cool tone brown base that shifts into this bright grass green as well as a purpley pink on the very end. We talked about these green pink kind of shifty shadows before. With this one though, the pink isn't as obvious because it kind of blends in with that cooler brown base. So the main shift in this one is definitely the green. Barbados. This shadow has a kind of medium to large particle size, and it is on the chunkier side, but it's a different type of chunky than the other ones that I mentioned before. However, although being a bit chunkier, it does smooth out quite nicely and you can't really tell when in use. This eyeshadow is a blue lover's dream. It does have like an almost navy base that shifts into more of a true blue, into an aqua, to a turquoise, to a green. This color has a lot of different shifts in it, but again, what I mentioned before, since the shifts are a bit closer together on the color scale, they aren't as obvious, but you can still obviously see that green shift compared to the blue base. At certain angles, you can also see a bit of a purple. Skyfall. This eyeshadow has a small to medium particle size and is again on the drier side that is a bit sheerer but can be built up. This one is quite sparkly and I like the texture of this one, although the particle size is smaller. This eyeshadow is perfect if you want to dip your tones into blue but you're not really sure about how to pull it off. The base is this kind of grayish blue that goes into a purple and then a pink and then a green. At certain angles, the green leans a bit more turquoise and in others a bit more gold. This shadow is definitely still a blue, but since it has a bit more of a green shift, it mellows down the blue a little bit and make it lots more wearable, at least for me. Forest Fairy. This eyeshadow is again on the drier side and is sheer but can be built up. It is even smoother than the last one and the particle size is definitely small. This eyeshadow is quite unique, but I don't find that I reach for it very often. The shifts aren't too obvious. It goes from like a turquoisey green base, it's still quite muted, into a powder blue kind of shift. You can also see a bit of pink and purple at certain angles, but the shift isn't too obvious and the texture isn't my favorite either because it is a bit more of a smoother formula. So again, it's not one that I reach for very often. Angel. I'm gonna sound like a broken record, but this is another shadow that is on the drier side with a smaller particle size. It's very, very similar to a lot of the shadows that I mentioned, hence is why I said this is the typical kind of Pastel Roses formula. This eyeshadow really isn't that shifty. It does have like a pastel blue kind of base. It has a little bit of green to it, but I wouldn't call it a turquoise. It's still definitely blue. Then on top it has a very subtle pink shift and at certain angles a subtle green. But again, the shifts aren't as obvious. I feel like it's because of the small particle size and the shadow being more satiny. It makes the shadow a bit more subtle and it's not my favorite. So those were all of the shadows. So let's look at the overview. So swatches from my fingers down is Taurus, Ultraviolet, Fairy Dust, Bombshell, Little Star, Pixie, Citrus, Pyramid, Lime Twist, Dragonfly, Autumn Leaves, Starburst, Starfish, Sunlight, Pumpkin, and the Black Friday shadow. Again, from my hand down, we have Electric Orange, Sandstorm, Lure, Nectarine, Peach Rose, Spectrum, Rainbow, Marshmallow, Love Letter, Bismuth, Starlight, Galaxy Dust, Very Peri, Sakura, and Magical. Then for the last swatches we have Dreamscape, Midnight Rose, Prism, Dreamcatcher, Phantom, Moon, Zoisite, Palm, Barbados, Skyfall, Forest Fairy, and Angel. So that was it for today, you guys. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoyed the swatches. Let me know if there was a specific eyeshadow that you thought was your favorite out of the ones that I swatched. Which one were you most intrigued by? I will have another swatch party up soon, but I will have another video up tomorrow, so make sure to check that out. And I hope you're having a lovely day wherever you are, and I will catch you then. Bye!